So that moves us to the third P, positioning of the qualitative researcher. And just a few comments on this. When I say positioning, I mean how you position yourself to the research questions, and that question being evolving, as I said. How you position yourself to the research participants, to the research recipients, because the recipients might be different from the participants. Also, how do you position yourself to the PhD frameworks in different institutions, article-based, monograph-based, and so on. But those are also positionings that you have to think about. As I said, in qualitative research, the researcher is the key instrument. Remember, you are the reason why the data is like this, the way you ask questions. The way you transcribe might be very differently transcribed by somebody else. Somebody might hear different things than what you have. So you are the main variable. So therefore, it is not at all necessary and advisable to hide behind an objective neutral position. Come out. Say, look, actually, I may have misheard it. So here is just a guess, informed guess, but I'm okay for any counter arguments. Okay? So in other words, in qualitative research, we should be more confessional. We should be more coming out type, not hiding behind the cloak of a neutral empirical design or rhetoric. As you can see, different traditions have very different views about how much or how close, approximate, the researcher should be positioned to the participants. Ethnomethodology CA would be one which would say that you become the participants, because they talk about participants' method, the emic perspective. So basically, there is no gap between you and the participants. So you should be able to analyze. So the point of view becomes conflated between the analyst and the participants. Otherwise, you can't do CA or ethnomethodology. In ethnography, people would say, we want to take their perspective, but there is still a gap. You can never become the natives of Africa. So there always, we'll take their position, we'll try to put ourselves in their shoes, but we can never become them. So you can see there are very interesting gaps in this positioning between ethnomethodology and ethnography already. If you're combining those two perspectives, you have to clarify and elaborate exactly how you have positioned yourself. That comes to this whole issue of emic, ethic, insider, outsider. And to me, they are not, again, black and white. It is much more of a continuum that we can talk about the positioning of yourselves on a continuum of insidedness and outsidedness, and both have challenges and both have problems, weaknesses. One is not any better than the other, just like the methodologies we talked about. So if you are a professional stranger, as Michael Agar would call it, as an outsider, as opposed to if you are already a professional practitioner, you are a teacher and you are studying your own practice. You are a supervisor and you are studying how to supervise. Okay? So now we have somebody who is a stranger but a professional, an outsider, somebody who is an insider but is a professional practitioner, a doctor, a nurse, a teacher, and so on. And one of the things I talk about is if we're trying to understand, I think this comes back to all these issues of understanding and where we stand, where we position ourselves. Actually, stand is a good word before we can understand. Where do we stand so that we can understand? So let's think about that. Okay. So I have said, unless you thickly participate, you cannot give a thick description in the context, in the situation, in the site. So one of the challenges for the outsiders is to make the strange familiar, because you are an outsider. So everything looks strange, but you have to make sense of it. It should become familiar as you describe it, as you participate. But if you are an insider, you are a teacher, a nurse, a manager, you have to do the opposite. You have to distance yourself from what really happens. Don't take too much for granted. And that's a big challenge for becoming an action researcher on your own practice. It's a huge challenge because you can't see yourself different from you being a nurse, teacher, and a researcher. So there you are trying to make the familiar strange, not the strange familiar. So something might look very familiar, but you should behave and pretend that it is strange. Otherwise, you'll never have a research orientation to that. And one of the anecdotes I remember, a real case, it's a sonographer, a radiographer who does ultrasound, was doing a PhD, and she was going to interview her colleagues back in the UK. So every time she picks up the microphone and sits down to talk, right, tell me about your daily practice and how you find your work. They say, come on, you know it. You don't want me to talk about all these things. So that's actually when the data is affected because it assumes you know it. Actually, you would be better off interviewing a stranger who you have never met. They might say, no, I didn't understand what you mean by black. Is that a color or is that a drink? So in other words, the more strange you are, and I'll come to this, how to become a stranger. That's a quality of good research. The researcher as stranger, and that's not easy. So the more you become a stranger, the more you can try to see what is familiar. But if you're too familiar in your situation, you cannot easily distance yourself, dissociate yourself from that. And that's what is actually called the Occam's razor. The more assumptions you make, the less explanatory your claim is. So if you make too many assumptions in your interpretation of the data, and the assumptions are not made manifest, explicit, then nobody can understand your interpretation. So the outsider can make overgeneralizations, drawing upon their disciplinary bias, their training, but so can the insider coming from their own practice and experience. So overgeneralization can be a challenge for both insiders and outsiders. So that's the continuum I would like to suggest. You have the insider, the emic, and the etic, the outsider. You can start from the bottom, which is the researcher as an outsider, coming from outside. Then you have the practitioner, which is the very insider, the more emic. Then interestingly, there are very many instances, even amongst yourselves, when you are a practitioner, a teacher, nurse, a social worker. Now you want to study that as your research. So that what is, I will call, a practitioner becoming a researcher. Okay? So somebody researching their own practice, their own activities, identities, and so on. Only on very, very few cases, you begin as an outsider, as a researcher, and you become so engrossed and become so familiar, you actually switch your job. So there are few people who have researched psychoanalysis and have become psychoanalysts. But they come from a language background. Actually, one of the examples is from Finland, Anssi Peräklö, a name that many people might know. He did a lot of work in CA-based research. Now he practices as a psychoanalyst, apart from his professorial job. There are few people I know who are doctors. They come to do a PhD in linguistics, get interested, then they become linguists and discourse analysts, and very good at that. So that can happen, that you started as a research interest, but you become a practitioner. So in other words, the inside-outside is not black and white. There are 50 shades of gray between them. And you have to try and position yourself. And it might be changing every day as you go through the process. I mentioned being imposed and being invited. Very rarely, PhD students get an invitation to do research. You have to beg. So when you beg, actually it's not a bad thing. They want to be helpful and open the doors, and you can do research. Okay? They all want to be helpful. A very good thing about doing research interviews as a PhD students, actually informants are very, very understanding. Oh, you're PhD. Okay, ask me more questions if you want. If you are not happy, ask me again, I'll tell something more. They want to help, which is a bias in itself. They won't talk to an outsider who already is a postdoc or a professor. So better to go and approach people saying, fake interviews. I am a PhD student and I am already in the deadline, please help. People will say, have some tea and I'll talk what happened in World War II. So actually, the challenge is equally. I have been a very invited researcher, and this person I'm talking about, an anthropologist, medical anthropologist, Charles Bosque, wrote a book called All God's Mistakes. And what he's saying, the more he got invited as a guest to the hospitals, the more there were expectations of what he should say. So that is a different bias. Can you see that? So when you're an outsider, you are better off. But if you're invited, they almost expect you to say good things about the top, the manager, the director, so you can't say nasty things. So the expectations are raised, which actually interferes with your methodological integrity, what you can analyze and how you can say these things. So it is very difficult for you to be detached and objective. If you're invited, you become one of them, and then the expectations grow. And this is what I meant by researcher as stranger. And that's a very well-known sociologist, Georg Simmel, when he's talking about researcher in the role of stranger, basically he's trying to highlight, foreground, the notion of objectivity. If you're a stranger, you can be more objective. If you are studying your own colleagues, your own students in your own workplace, you can't be objective, no way. You didn't like that colleague for the last 15 years. So how can you today say, right, I'll interview you? So maybe you will deselect the colleague you don't like. So you can't be objective. So basically saying that objectivity, if that's what we value in empirical research, and we do, then it's better to position yourself as a stranger. So go to a place. Don't study in your own country. Go to another country. Don't study your own colleagues and students. Find a third safe space. So what he's basically trying to say, that you can approach, confront your people and the data in a distinctly objective attitude. And objective is in quotation marks. It's not objective in the sense of neutral objective. So he qualifies, it's an attitude that does not signify mere detachment. You shouldn't be totally detached. So objective is not being detached or non-participation. Instead, it's a distinct structure of being both remote and near. It's like coming in and out, being both indifferent and involved. Basically what I said, that you try to make the strains familiar, but don't take too much for granted. And those things are the qualities that one has to inculcate, and they are not something we can teach. We don't have a course saying, okay, how to be involved, how to be detached, or how to be indifferent. I think it's something we have to come to learn in the process of doing research, and we all do it differently. So as you can see, the positioning of the researcher can range from everything we do. The way we select a site, where is it that we're going to do research, how do we recruit participants, how are we going to collect data, how are we going to transcribe the data, there are so many different ways to do that, how are you going to interpret the data, how are you going to disseminate the findings. At every stage of this process, we can see that you have to take a position for each one of those. And it might change as you go along. Maybe you never finish a PhD, but write a diary about what you did. That could be a PhD, a bestseller, and maybe you will be famous without having a PhD. So why the PhD failed, but you are now a celebrity? Why not? But those are the real things that it's unconscious. We never document these things. Once you start documenting, they're fascinatingly insightful. And then you take very different roles, negotiating with a headmaster, with a hospital director, how you position yourself as a data gatherer. Do you go formally dressed, or do you go with your boots and things? All these things can have an impact without you knowing. How do you transcribe? You may be very good at interpreting but not transcribing data. That's a different skill. How do you analyze and how do you disseminate findings? Again, I'm saying at a very practical level, the roles, there is nothing to suggest that you can be competent in all these roles as a researcher. So once you see yourself, divide yourself into a data gatherer, analyst, transcriber, interpreter, disseminator, you may be in a scale of 1 to 10 in very different positions. You may not be totally competent in all these things. I don't think that's true. I can't say that for myself either. So this is something like a self-assessment. It's a tool. We need to reflect and be realistic in what we can and cannot do. Sometimes in those disciplines where it is possible, I advise hire an interviewer or hire somebody to do your research questionnaire and say it in your work that I could not do the research because I get emotionally upset or I can't ask in that way. So the research interviews were done by somebody else. Perfectly fine in many disciplines. Surely, if it can be justified that it enriched the data, we should all do that. So we shouldn't be trying to do everything, but that's what we want to do in a PhD because we want to learn and demonstrate that we're good at all these things. But these have consequences in terms of our abilities.